Welcome everyone. I'm Erin Douglas. I'm a climate reporter for the Boston Globe and moderator of today's discussion. I am delighted to be joined by our esteemed panelists for this conversation about water quality. We have Ronnie Levin, an instructor of environmental health here at Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. We also have Reverend Vernon K. Walker. He is the Climate Justice Program Director at Clean Water Action and the Clean Water Fund, and an Associate Minister at Massachusetts Avenue Baptist Church. Thanks for joining us. And then we also have Brooke Floyd on the screen with us, joining us remotely from Jackson, Mississippi. Brooke is the Director of Programs and Community-Led Governance Initiatives at People's Advocacy Institute. Thanks so much for joining us today for the discussion. So we also want to thank the audience for being here today. This event is part of the Dr. Lawrence H. and Roberta Cohn Forum series. The studio thanks the Cohn family and welcomes them and all of our in-studio and online viewers today. We also want to particularly welcome Roberta Cohn, who is joining us today online. So let's just get started a little bit. So 10 years ago in April 2014, the water supply source for Flint, Michigan was changed to the Flint River in a cost-cutting measure. The water quality of the Flint River began to corrode the old lead pipe systems, causing lead and other contaminants to leach into the drinking water for thousands of people. The problem went unacknowledged by public officials for more than a year, even as residents complained about discolored and bad tasting water, and they also complained about skin rashes and other health problems. And then finally, a coalition of residents, activists, and scientists brought those problems to light and found with studies that there were very high levels of lead in the water across the city that had spiked, and that the incidence of blood levels of lead in children had nearly doubled. So the studio has a video about Flint that they'd like to show, but before that, I just want to welcome our panelists and ask each of you to maybe briefly share a little bit about what impact or what the Flint water crisis meant to you personally, and if that particular crisis impacted your work. So let's start with you, Ronnie.
So I was at EPA at the time, and I was a drinking water substance expert, and it was appalling and frightening, but it was not a total surprise because these lead pipes had been in place for 130 years, 140 years, and it was just a matter of time before we had another catastrophe. And we have had in the past little lead waterborne outbreaks before from various reasons. We hadn't ever had a whole city that went and got poisoned. And we could see this happening because being on the staff level, there were memos that were going out, and they were acknowledging, realizing, screaming about what was going on. But it was really frustrating and infuriating that we were there and couldn't do anything because it wasn't a surprise. These lead pipes are out there. They haven't moved. They are a straight line from the house to the street. It was not a big surprise, but there were specific questions that were answered in a way that poisoned people. And it didn't have to go that way.
Totally. Vernon, what did Flint mean to you?
Well, I think from an environmental justice standpoint, it is an example of a miscarriage of justice. When we think about the Flint crisis, we think about inadequate treatment and testing of the water that resulted in a series of major water quality and health issues for Flint residents. And it's really a story of bad decision making compounded by environmental injustice. When we think about tens of thousands of Flint residents that were exposed to dangerous levels of lead and outbreaks of Legionnaire disease that killed at least 12 people and sickened dozens of more. So we know that this is a situation where communities of color were overlooked and often ignored. So for the environmental justice movement, Flint is an example of why folks who are passionate about environmental justice are organizing, are strategizing, and are mobilizing to ensure that Black and brown communities have a voice, and voices are not ignored but are heard, particularly when it comes to lead, and when it comes to drinking water, and when it comes to overall, and then when it comes to broader issues of health and environmental justice.
For sure. And Brooke, do you want to chime in as well on this question of what Flint has meant to you personally?
10 years ago, I was teaching elementary students. I was a teacher. I think when I first heard about it, I immediately felt a sense of not relief, but okay, this is happening other places, because I knew that our water wasn't okay here, and we had been living with it for a very long time. I didn't quite know what was wrong with it, but I knew some of the things that they were saying, and the problems that they were having, that we were having those same things here, and we had been living with them for a very long time, and nobody was paying attention.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing. So the studio has selected a short video from the Natural Resources Defense Council to kind of set the stage for this discussion. So let's watch that now, if we can.
Pediatricians know lead. We know what lead can do. Every agency tells us, from the CDC to the American Academy of Pediatrics, that there's no safe level of lead. When I heard of the possibility that there was lead in the water, it was a call to action. We decided to look at the lead levels just in our clinic. So the Hurley Children's Clinic sees the most Flint kids. And we compared lead levels before the water switch to lead levels after the water switch. And we did see this increase in the percentage of children with elevated lead levels. And we were absolutely heartbroken. We had to share this information as soon as possible. So we decided to hold a press conference.
This research is concerning. These results are concerning.
To alert our families to stop using this water, to use bottled water, to use filters, and hopefully to be able to get the water source changed back to Detroit. Right after we shared this information, my science was dismissed, the research was dismissed. The state came out publicly stating that I was wrong, that I was causing near hysteria. So I shouldn't have been surprised, because for 18 months, the heroic people of Flint had been dismissed. The moms, the activists, the pastors, the journalists, the scientists.
That's a very powerful video. I want to start maybe with Vernon, and going back to what you were talking about with the environmental justice concerns and how Flint sort of changed that conversation, or at least, brought this issue to the forefront of a lot of people's minds nationally. And do you think that Flint is having a lasting impact on that discussion now? And where will we head now with the environmental justice movement? Like, how do you think that we can move forward from this crisis, being that it's been 10 years later?
Well, we have an administration that understands the importance of environmental justice, and it understands tackling the environmental crisis from a federal government perspective. So I think that because we have a presidential administration that's sympathetic to ensuring that organizations that are in environmental justice communities are able to receive funding to be able to address these issues, and also work with residents on the ground. I think Flint inspired that. I think Flint brought to bear what was often ignored, which is the voices of communities of color related to the drinking water, and related to other public health issues that communities of color face. It's not lost on me how there is a connection between public health and environmental health, and public health and the climate crisis. So I think Flint served as a wake-up call, if you will, to across the nation, that this issue is just not only happening here, but it's also happening in places, in other communities of color. When we think about PFAS and how PFAS is more present in communities of color than other communities. When we also think about other environmental justice issues that communities of color are impacted, we think about cancer and other ailments. So essentially, I think that the water crisis in Flint was a linchpin to mobilizing grassroots activists and decision makers and policy makers to begin to be in the same room together, to have conversations, to take these issues more seriously.
Yeah, and Brooke, I know that in Jackson, the water contamination and water quality issues there have resulted in water shutoffs, and also the community's endured many boil water notices. You talked a little about how those are chronic problems that the community has been dealing with for a long time. With regard to Flint, do you think that the legacy of Flint has affected the community's response to these issues? Do you think it has changed the conversation with policymakers at all? How do you think that, how do you see the relationship between these crises?
I definitely think it made people listen when we stood up and called for action and attention. I mean, we have lived with these issues for a very long time and did not receive the state help that we should have for all those years. But on August 29th, when the system failed and we took to the streets and sounded the alarm, every 2 weeks we marched and media came and we shared our story, we would not have gotten the response that we received from the federal government and from, just across the world if Flint hadn't happened. I can't, without Flint, we would not have gotten the help. We would have not gotten the answer. The President Biden and the Vice President would not have responded. We would not have been sent federal dollars. The grants that Jackson applied for would not have been given immediately. The community groups that came together, and we just received this word, what was it, 2 weeks ago, that they have allowed us to have a part and a seat at the table in going forward with the DOJ and the EPA and the third-party manager that was forced to take over our water. But we wouldn't have been given those rights. That wouldn't have been an option if Flint hadn't happened. So most definitely, because of Flint, we are here.
One thing that I think is particularly concerning about the situation in Flint was that people and children specifically were kind of used as the primary indicators of the lead contamination, and we found out about the contamination in part by testing people. And I'm curious, Ronnie, being that you've spent a lot of your career on lead, if you can talk about how we discover lead contamination and maybe how our systems can discover lead contamination before it reaches the people, and maybe what could be done better from a public health perspective in that.
So let me just start out with, why do we test kids? We test kids because they are uniquely sensitive to the health effects of lead. Everybody who's exposed to lead has health damages from it, but kids are really very sensitive. And they are sensitive to the effects, and they absorb more. And the reason they absorb more is because they're calcium deficient, and lead follows the calcium line. So we test them. We care about it because we can do something about kids being highly exposed. We can also do something for adults, but less. And the manifestations are clearer in kids. And so they're really sensitive, and we can do something, but it's actually a bad indicator. I mean, we're waiting to see whether the kids are poisoned, and then we're going to do something. I mean, this is a little bit backwards. And then a little bit more of a perspective. You asked about 6 questions, and so I'm just going to choose
the
sure. ones that come to
Fair
mind.
enough.
Sorry. That lead is something we can do something about. The way that we reduce lead across the board, contamination of drinking water, is by reducing how corrosive the water is. And once you make the water less corrosive, then your water heaters last longer, and your faucets last longer, and your appliances last longer. And so the benefits of reducing how corrosive your water is far exceed the costs of the treatment. And so again, it's a decision by water utilities to not use corrosion control, even though it would benefit them. And then what I said beforehand about the lead pipes, except for Chicago, which continued to install lead pipes until they were federally banned in 1986, in general, most cities stopped installing lead pipes by 1920. So those pipes have been there for 100 years. They haven't moved. They are a straight line from the house to the street. It's not a big surprise. And the fact that we've let them stay there is shame on us. And a lot of it is willful. It's not like we don't know who replaces and who doesn't replace. People who have money replace their pipes, and people who don't have money don't replace their pipes. And so we know this. This isn't new science. All that we're doing is more decimal points. But you know, we've known about this for a very long time.
What would be a better way than testing the children to find out whether a community is actively being exposed?
How about testing the water? How about don't wait until the kids are poisoned? How about testing the water? But I repeat myself.
Let's broaden the conversation out from lead just a little bit and maybe talk about some of the most common water system vulnerabilities in the U.S. You know, Vernon, you already touched on PFAS. Do you want to expand on that a little bit? Or, you know, what do each of you think are some of the more common problems in our water system that we could address?
Yeah, so PFAS is a forever chemical and is virtually in a lot of things. Such as the firefight, what firefighters use, of the form that firefighters use to put out the fires. And there is a broader movement to try to eliminate PFAS. But what we saw and what we see across the country in environmental justice communities, that the PFAS levels are a lot higher. In fact, here at the School of Public Health, there was a report released last year that details and talks about PFAS levels being elevated in communities of color. So and one of the things that I think we can do around PFAS is recognize that it is tied to a climate issue. And that these issues are interconnected. So I think particularly for our audience that may be online and even here, if you're interested in advocacy around PFAS, and particularly the southern states, they don't really have a lot of protections against PFAS, but you can look in your state house and see if there are particular bills that the state legislators are pushing. And what we've noticed that in the South, that a lot of the bills are absent. But if there is a particular bill around limiting the use of PFAS that's in a state that you live in, then you can call your state legislator and let them know that you want to see them support the passage of this particular bill. So that's one example of a forever chemical and one ways that water quality is impacted by the amount or level of PFAS.
Ronnie?
So U.S. public drinking water is arguably the safest and most reliable in the world, but it is not risk-free. And it's certainly not as good as it could be. It could be better, safer, fairer, and more sustainable. And unfortunately, the risks of contamination follow known and disturbing patterns that we see over and over again. For instance, nitrate contamination is disproportionately a problem in shallow groundwater systems, small systems, agricultural areas, and heavily Hispanic Latino communities tend to have much higher nitrate levels. Lead, as we've spoken about, is a problem in older cities, particularly low income and minority communities. Uranium is a problem near old mining sites. It heavily impacts Native American and tribal communities. And so we can see these patterns repeating again and again. It's not a surprise.
I want to go to Brooke, because one thing I've been wondering about, with your situation in Jackson is, being that you've observed this and advocated for water quality for a long time, what do you think is needed to ensure that the residents of Jackson have safe water? Like, what do you think needs to change?
Well, one of the things that we fought for is for our water to stay public. I think that's imperative. I also think that transparency of any public utility is important. I think Jackson is not unique in this, and I think that's been expressed by the other panelists. This is a problem that is all over our state. When you talk about the PFAS chemicals, 80 out of 82 counties in our state have them in their water. And so, this is rural, this is urban. We are one of the poorest states in the union. Every year we hit that mark. And so we have a lot of communities in this state that are struggling with water. So we are pushing to maintain public control. We are pushing to have community at the table, and we were granted that by the judge to be in the rebuilding or refurbishing, whatever you want to call it, repairing of our water system. But I think we also have to, those lines that were said, from the house to the road, everybody can't afford to replace them. And so we're going to have to look at what that looks like once these lines are repaired in our city, what it looks like for homeowners that cannot afford to replace those lines. Because you can repair the lines, but if every household is still not receiving clean water, then it's not going to matter. We're still going to be having water that is not safe and not healthy for people. And so we want to make sure that not just Jackson, but the whole state is able to have clean drinking water. And so we have to look into programs, whether that's funded by the state or the federal government or private funders. I really don't care. But we're going to have to look collectively, and I'm talking to everybody in the room, wherever you are, that everyone deserves this, because it's going to be everyone's problem. It may be affecting Jackson or Flint 10 years ago, but every place in this country has infrastructure, and it's aging, and it has not been fixed. It has not been repaired. The pipes are messed up. There's stuff in the water, and we have to do this together. And community has to be at the forefront in order for us to say what's wrong, and the systems have to be transparent so we know what's going on in the first place.
Yeah. It seems like some of the more common solutions, though, are a lot shorter term, like handing out bottled water or telling people, issuing a no-use, telling the public don't use your water, telling the public to boil your water. Those are some of the more common responses that we can expect during a water crisis. And Brooke, I'd be interested to hear about how the community has responded to those, and also whether you think it works. You have to do something in the immediate term, but then what impact does that have on people in the community? Can you just talk a little bit about those, very short-term solutions that the government tends to roll out?
So our organization partner with the city anytime there is a water need crisis here, especially August 29th, 2022. And so we immediately set up stations all over the city. When FEMA comes in and partners with MEMA to set up sites, usually they do that at like one major location. We are not a big city, so public transportation is not readily available the same way it would be in Chicago or New York or Boston. And so everyone doesn't have a car. And so those sites, you have to drive up and get your water. And so we had to do deliveries. We had to let people walk up and get a pack of water at our sites. And so, yes, people are very receptive of that here because they need water and we're used to it. But it is a problem because everybody can't drive to go get their water. I don't like giving bottled water out, and because it's a problem. You have plastic bottles everywhere, and it piles up. And we were on a months-long thing of not having clean water. In my house, we still don't drink the water because I have 7-year-old children, and I just don't want them drinking it. They don't even brush their teeth with it. So we order water that's delivered, and I have filters to be safe. So as a more sustainable solution, I got grants in order to supply filters to our community. And so now we are looking at getting folks to match those grants through the CDC Wash Foundation, and looking to get folks to match those grants to provide filters, because bottled water is just not it. And I don't want to fill up any more landfills and do any more damage to our environment than we're already doing. But water filters for me are the way to go, and they last longer, and folks can turn on their faucet and have a peace of mind.
Yeah. I just want to go briefly to Ronnie. Did you want to add anything on the water system vulnerabilities?
No, I think we pretty much touched it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great. All of the panelists, we're running up against time a little bit, but I was wondering, like, if you could wave a magic wand and do one thing to improve water quality in this country, what would you say? And I'll start with you, Ronnie.
I think all of us have said that the infrastructure is degraded and it needs investment, and we haven't invested for the past 50 years, and so we have to catch up. But climate change is going to make this all way worse.
Can you expand on why climate, like what the impact might be, whether that's
Well,
increasing
it's gonna,
heat or
right.
Yeah.
So it's going to increase microbial contamination. It's going to make lead much worse. Nitrate levels are likely to increase, arsenic. And once contamination, like with PFAS, has happened, you can't undo it. So as part of our climate resiliency, we just need to be dealing with this.
Vernon, do you have one grand idea for improving water system quality?
I think one panacea would be ensuring that municipal governments and state governments are funding and doing more rigorous testing around the presence of lead pipes in homes. So here's a very pragmatic tip. If you take a penny and you scratch it on the pipe, and if that color turns gray or silver, then it could be lead. And one of the things you might want to do is then call your water department and ask about a lead pipe replacement. So I think one of the things that to address this issue is to ensure that all lead pipes are taken out of homes from the homes that are in the East Coast to the West Coast to the South to the Southwest to all over this country. But we know that doesn't roll in on the wheels of osmosis, and we know that does not come in through inevitability, but it only will come when we are, as a people, when we're united and we find a cause to be united, such as lead pipe replacement, such as preparing for extreme weather and fighting to reduce our carbon footprints, and also racial justice and housing justice, etc. And when we find when we see that these issues are interconnected and they are interlocking, then I think we can begin to really address the lead pipe issue in a systemic way, and a bold and radical way. Then I think we can begin to address racial justice in a systemic way and a monumental way, and we can also begin to address the housing crisis, etc. So all these evils are linked, and all these issues are linked. But if I had a magic wand, that would be the first thing to do, is to ensure that lead pipes are replaced in every home with zero expense to the renter or the homeowner, so we can ensure people are drinking safe water.
Yeah. And just lastly, Brooke.
Well, I agree with the infrastructure and the lead pipes in homes. The climate change is exacerbating our issue here. The extreme cold, which we are not used to in Mississippi, causes our pipes to crack. We are used to extreme heat, but the varying changes now. We live on Yazoo clay here, and so it is causing our stuff to break even more, and so it's making our issues worse. And so yes, infrastructure, wave the wand, please. Infrastructure is needed here.
I'm going to ask you all just one more quick question, because I want to end on a more optimistic note than that. And that is, what are some tangible actions that folks here in this room could take, whether they're going into a career in public health or whether they're just, people who live in their community, that you think could help improve this situation? And maybe we'll go backwards this time. We'll go to Brooke.
I think it's to understand your power as an individual. 10 years ago when Flint happened, I was a teacher. And, it was kind of like you're resigned to, use bottled water here. That's what you do. You boil your water, you use bottled water. And then here I am now in this space realizing that no, that's not okay. We don't have to live like this. I'm going to call my congressman. I'm going to call my legislator. I'm going to march in the streets. I'm going to share on social media. Whatever you can do from your little corner of the world makes a difference. And once you spread that message and more people spread that message and more people call and more people march and more people do these things, then it becomes a collection of voices that cannot be drowned out. And I think that's so important.
For sure. And Vernon?
The quote comes to my mind from Dr. King, who said that we're all tied in the inescapable garment of mutuality, and what affects one directly affects us all indirectly. And then he went on to say that I can't be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. And he said this quote at the Birmingham jail in 1963. And he was essentially arguing why racial justice, his fight for racial justice brought him to Birmingham. For us, I think if we see the interconnectedness of these issues and people that are affected disproportionately by lead pipes, and we begin to see it as our issue, then we can begin to say, well, we're not going to just sit idly by while this is happening. And one of the things that I like about Clean Water Action is that we are a national organization. We're in 12 states and also have a chapter in DC. And we work with partners across the country to invest and to address environmental racism that disproportionately impacts Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color, working towards a healthier and safer communities for future generations. So I would advise folks to find an organization that you can support, that is working towards environmental justice, that is working towards racial justice, etc. Maybe find ways to volunteer, maybe find ways to donate, maybe find ways to amplify the messages that they are putting on social media to your social network, because I think the more we began to broadcast this message of environmental justice and also water issues, I think we can move towards a quicker solution for this issue. So don't feel powerless, don't feel hopeless, and really change does start with one. And I am convinced of that. And then we'll find out that that one just doesn't exist in a silo. But there are other folks who feel like that as well. So I think there is power in community organizing, and power in standing up and saying that enough is enough. And I think meeting with policymakers to let them know that constituents are concerned about water quality issues, and we can't just sit idly by while people are suffering in Flint, or people are suffering in New Orleans, etc., because we're all tied in the inescapable garment of mutuality.
And Ronnie?
It's simpler. Find out where your water comes from. So water for most Americans is invisible. You turn on that faucet and there it is, and nobody ever thinks. So find out about your water, and don't trust just that the bureaucrats and politicians who run your water utility tell you it's fine. That doesn't mean that it is. Right? My kids tell me that they've cleaned their room, and I don't necessarily believe them. And so I think that this is something that it's an easy thing. Learn about your water. When you go to turn on that faucet, know what's there.
Great. So before we move to the in-person audience Q&A section, I'd like to say goodbye to our online viewers and a thank you to all of our panelists for lending their expertise to the discussion today. If you missed any part of the discussion, you can watch the recording on the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health YouTube page. So thanks so much to the audience for joining us.